Street to Main Street report.
The following is a paid commercial program. Opinions expressed are the sole responsibility of the party expressing them.
If tomorrow all the things were gone, I'd work for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. To be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me, and I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Well, good morning, Utah. This is Hans Anderson. Welcome to our call-in show. I hope you'll participate with us this morning. 224-1414. That's 801-224-1414. And again, we're going to be discussing the United States Constitution. We're going to be discussing warnings we've been given about it, and try and discuss our own spiritual understanding or welfare based on how well we're doing with it. I hope you were listening to Donna Max earlier this morning, just before I got on here, and heard messages out of the Old Testament. Nothing has changed in 4,000 or 5,000 years. This is still a spiritual battle. The beautiful thing about Scriptures is that you can understand what is happening to nations. If you don't have the Scriptures, you really have no idea what's happened. You would have no idea what happened to the Nephites, the Jaredites. You'd just say, oh, there's some interesting relics. I wonder what happened. I've been to Israel, Egypt. You go there, you see relics. And if you don't have the Scriptures, you just plain do not know that when you obey God, you're blessed as a nation. When you disobey Him, you will be destroyed. You need the Scriptures. And as Donna was teaching us this morning, out of the Old Testament, you serve God or you suffer. It's very simple. We often don't see it because we suffer at the hands of our fellow man, or so we think. But God protects those that are trying to serve Him. Well, let me get going here. I hope we get a few call in here today. I'm going to give some more copies of the Constitution to people who call in here today. Going to have Richard take down your name and your address so I can mail it to you if you want to participate. I hope you do. I'm going to refer to some quotes I've used before because these are some of my favorites. And I hope those of you that have listened before will bear with me as I do this because I think these are so important. Here's one of my favorite quotes, John Adams. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. That says it all for those who want to know, just as you get out of the Old Testament, moral, religious people. And in this case, we were going to have self-rule, which was a step up from the history of governments throughout the world. I believe our Constitution is under attack, and every time we adopt more socialist programs, I believe that's helping to destroy us. And one reason I believe this is quoting the earliest prophet that I actually remember, David O. McKay. He was ordained an apostle in 1906. Remember the first presidency in 34, the prophet in 51. This is a statement he gave us in 52. During the first half of the 20th century, we have traveled far into the soul-destroying land of socialism. I hope you'll reflect on that, because most people think socialism is just an economic philosophy, a device for redistribution of wealth from the haves to the have-nots, and it really is not anything of any consequence. That seems to be its economic effect. redistribute the wealth. But President McKay said it is soul-destroying, and I want to go into some of that today. What can be soul-destroying about taking money from the haves and giving it to the have-nots? Soul-destroying for both the takee and the taker. Here, President McKay had been in the highest councils of the church for 44 of those 50 years that he's talking about, and that was his opinion. You know, I don't happen to know the future. I do not know what's going to happen. However, we ought to know something about why we will have grief if we don't follow our prophet's political counsel. We need to base our political beliefs and our personal beliefs on what these men have taught us. They do know more than we do. They're smarter than us. We ought to listen to them. And when they say it's soul-destroying, we ought to figure out ways to walk away from it. There's another great man I wanted to talk about here today, J. Reuben Clark. I've mentioned him before. I wanted to go into one of his writings. This is from a book my parents gave me in '62. I've quoted from it before. I wanted to do it again. This is pages 5 and 6. Now, in the last years, we in America have gone a long distance towards the adoption of the Roman concepts and the abuses against property rights and human rights and liberties which are possible under that system. And let me say here and now that in the whole history of the human race, from Adam until now he's a long time ago, but he was considered, a great historian and a great constitutionalist, a great scriptorian. We don't hear much about him because he's been gone a long time. But let me keep going here from his words from his day. Tyranny has never come to live with any people with a placard on his breast bearing his name. He always comes in deep disguise, sometimes proclaiming an endowment of freedom, sometimes promising help to the unfortunate and downtrodden, not by creating something for those who do not have, but by robbing those who have. But tyranny is always a wolf in sheep's clothing, and he always ends by devouring the whole flock, saving none. Well, he's talking about socialism here. Well, the next quote I wanted to go out into his book is under his subtitle, Fullness of Iniquity, to see how strong he felt about socialism and about what we in America are doing, and how strongly he felt this is nothing but Pete and repeat, a parallel to the Nephite history, the Jaredite history also. Okay, here's Fullness of Iniquity, quoting J. Reuben Clark. We are not given the step-by-step backsliding of this Jareditic civilization till it reached the social and governmental chaos that the record sets out. But those steps seem wholly clear from the results. Now, you and I read the history of the Jaredites in the Book of Ether, and a little bit in the Doctrine and Covenants referred to, but the Book of Ether. And now, let me read what he gets out of it. Another reason we need to go back and study it from a political standpoint and not strictly, I wonder if we ought to pay our tithing or not, or go to church on Sunday. Read it from a political standpoint. Okay, here's him. I'll keep going here. I love this guy. Put into modern terms, we can understand them. First, there was a forsaking of the righteous life and the working of wickedness. Then must have come the extortion and oppression of the poor by the rich. Then retaliation and reprisal by the poor against the rich. Then would come a cry to share the wealth, which should belong to all. Does have a familiar ring to it, like what you hear on the news all the time right now? We're going to share the wealth, take from the haves, give the have-nots. He's talking about the Jaredites here, though. Then the easy belief that society owed every man a living, whether he worked or not. Then the keeping of a great body of idlers. Then when community revenues failed to do this, as they always have failed and always will fail, a self-helping by one to the goods of his neighbor, and finally when the neighbor resisted, as resist he must, or starve with his family, then death to the neighbor and all that belonged to him. And then he says, this was the decreed fullness of iniquity. Then came the end. The Jaredites were wiped out in accordance with the everlasting decree of God. Still quoting J. Reuben Clark here. A nation has been born. It has grown to maturity, then to a powerful manhood, had then gone on to sin, decay, and destruction, and all because its people refused to heed the promises and commandments of Him who is their Creator and Father, all because the people who possessed the land had failed to serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ. Okay, I want to go a few more pages here. He's talking about socialism here, and this is in his warning to America. The next subtitle he has here is Another Fullness of Iniquity. Now, this one, of course, is referring to the Nephites. We've just finished wiping out the Jaredites, and he attributes it to socialism, personal unrighteousness, not following their prophets. Let's go on to the Nephites now. The recounting the history of this people is unnecessary because you know it. Beginning with mere disputes, then grew bickerings, then quarrelings, then ruptures, then two peoples, then one cursed for its iniquities, then wars and counterwars, while this people marched steadily towards their fullness of iniquity. Finally there had come to all the people the same wickedness that was among the Jaredites. And if they perish, it will be like unto the Jaredites, because of the willfulness of their hearts, seeking for blood and revenge, which he referred to up here among the Jaredites as the redistribution of wealth, taking from the haves, giving to the have-nots. Finally it leads to their war and ultimately blood, revenge, destruction. Well, the judgment and blessings are part of the Book of Mormon, and they're part of the warning to us. If you read Moroni, his words to us, 1,000 years after the arrival of the Nephites, that's when he was alive. Remember, he was the last great writer in the Book of Mormon, the last prophet. And 1,000 years before the era of the Gentiles, before we came. Remember 1492, he's finishing up about 421. The Nephites came over here about 600 B.C. He's finishing up the end of theirs. So 1,000 years before, 1,000 years after, he had either read or witnessed or recorded or transcribed the full record, and looked down to the day of us Gentiles, and declared, And this cometh unto you, O ye Gentiles, that ye may know the decrees of God, that ye may repent, and not continue in your iniquities until the fullness come. There's that fullness again. That ye may not bring down the fullness of the wrath of God upon you, as the inhabitants of the land have hitherto done. Reading some more out of Ether here, continuing next verse. Behold, this is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage, and from captivity, and from all of the nations under heaven, if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ, who hath been manifested by the things which we have written. So, you want to give us a call here and participate in this, 801-224-1414. Appreciate hearing from you. I'd like to hear your comments, your thoughts, if you're listening to us today. Let me ask further, is there any evidence we're on this socialist road to the fullness of iniquity that Jerry Reuben Clark talked about, that the Nephites went through, that the Jaredites went through? Remember the Jaredites, they had a 2,000-year history here on this land. Well, I'll keep going here. Give us a call, though, 801-224-1414. Love to hear your thoughts on this. President Hunter, we've referred to him in the past, where he said, quoting him again here, this tendency towards socialism and welfare statism is a result of personal unrighteousness. Repeating President McKay again, we have traveled far down the soul-destroying road of socialism. That's true. Now, I don't have the ability to identify when our cup is full. I don't know when we have a fullness of iniquity, as Jerry Reuben Clark referred to the Nephites and the Jaredites, in which Moroni talked about. Going back to the Book of Mormon as a witness to us, July 28, 1976, Ezra Taft Benson wrote my father a letter. And he said in part, I acknowledge with appreciation your letter of July 24 regarding the two pieces of legislation which you and your associates are supporting. My father was actually in the state legislature for a couple of terms. I am very pleased to note that you feel that what you are proposing is supported strongly by the Book of Mormon. So my dad's trying to get his political views out of the Book of Mormon. Then President Benson goes on to say, I'm a great believer in the Book of Mormon and feel strongly that it was written for our day and time. I have said to many people that a person will come to be better informed regarding what's happening in the world today by reading the Book of Mormon than all the magazines, newspapers combined. So he's saying stuff in the Book of Mormon that most people do not see unless they go at it and say, okay, I'm going to go through it this time and see what the political statements are here, the political warnings, what's happening. Just as Donna was going through the Bible, what are the political warnings there? Students of government, students of the Scriptures, students of history can often see things an inexperienced and an untrained eye will pass right over. We can and should learn from the experiences that these men have brought to us. What does the Lord think about laws and government? Referring to President Benson's letter to my father, I remember years ago my father coming into the kitchen and pointing out to me a letter in the Book of Mormon, written by Gidgiddoni, the chief of the Gadianton robbers. It was written to Laconius, the governor of the Nephites. And I'm not going to read the whole letter, just certain parts of it, but my dad used to ask, after pointing some of this stuff out to me, why would the Lord have his prophet Mormon put letters in here from one of the worst guys in the whole Book of Mormon? Let me read part of this letter. Therefore I write unto you, desiring that ye would yield up unto this my people your cities, your lands, and your possessions, rather than that they should visit you with the sword, and that destruction should come upon you. Or in other words, yield yourselves up unto us, and unite with us, and become acquainted with our secret works, and become our brethren, that ye may be like unto us, not our slaves, but our brethren, and partners of all our substance. You know, my father read this letter to me. It's 10 verses long. He read this to me, and then he said, you know, I have read this 1,000 times if I've read it once. And he says, but I missed this. I missed this. Partners of all our substance. These Gadianton robbers were nothing but a bunch of communists, a bunch of socialists. There it is. They wanted to use government to redistribute wealth. They said to the Nephites, we'll have a peace treaty here. Just give us the reins of government, and we will redistribute wealth. You'll be partners of all our substance. We don't need to be fighting each other. Just join us. Then my dad said, you know, if I missed that all these years, what else am I missing in this book? My father, he read the Book of Mormon almost every day his whole life. He learned to read the Book of Mormon when he was a youth. His mother didn't send him to school till he was 8, and he was learning to read out of the Book of Mormon. They lived out in the boonies. You know, another truth he taught me from the Book of Mormon that fits in with what Ezra Taft Benson and J. Wynne Clark said was that the Gadianton robbers were not content just to rob and to kill and to murder. They started out something like our terrorists of today, blowing things up. Well, maybe they didn't have dynamite, but anyway, raiding, stealing, murdering. But what those people were after was just like our socialists of today. They wanted control of government. I mean, this guy writing the letter to the Nephites said, all I want is control of government. I want to redistribute the wealth. I want you to be partners of all our substance, our brethren. That's what they wanted, standing out there in their blood-soaked sheepskins and painted up like wild terrorists, but that's what they wanted, control of government to redistribute wealth. I've already referred to the tyranny that President Clark talked about, how it doesn't come with a banner on its chest saying, here's what I'm doing. They come saying, I'm going to help the unfortunate and the downtrodden, just like these Gadianton robbers, just like our socialists of today. I'm here to help the poor folk. Well, if you believe President Clark's words about the fullness of iniquity among the Nephites and the Jaredites, then you see that socialism, through corrupting their laws, is their modus operandi. That is where they're going. Now let's go back to Helaman chapter 7 for an example of this, another example of this among the Nephites. And this is the story of Nephi on his tower praying outside and out loud. I recall that he had been on a mission, and he came home very sad and very discouraged. He came home, and nobody had wanted to listen to him. Nobody wanted to be Nephi's friend. Well, he gets on his tower, and he started talking about the Gadianton robbers filling the judgment seats, altering the laws of the people, and doing great evil. He got so discouraged with the citizens of his day that he wrote, oh, and maybe some of you feel like this someday. I do too, except I love a hot shower and air conditioning and a car and all those other things. Maybe that's why I ended up here this day. But anyway, here he's discouraged. He's talking about his life. The Nephi. Oh, that I could have had my days in the days when my father Nephi first came out of the land of Jerusalem, that I could have joyed with him in the promised land. Then were his people easy to be entreated, firm to keep the commandments of God, and slow to be led to do iniquity. And they were quick to hearken unto the words of the Lord. Sounds like me talking about Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Well, they had their grief too, but man. Yea, if my days could have been in those days, then would my soul have had joy in the righteousness of my brethren. But behold, I am consigned that these are my days, and that my soul shall be filled with sorrow because of the wickedness of this my brethren. Okay, that's Helaman 7:7-9. Well, we all have our sorrows, and these prophets, they have feelings too, and in this case, they wrote them down and left them to us. But have you ever wished you could have been born in a different era? Because this one seems so bad. Well, as I've just read to you, prophets like Nephi did too. And we have to say the same thing that he said. I am consigned that these are my days. This is when God sent us here. We have to make the same observation and the same resolve. These are our days. We're going to make the best of it. What had happened among the Nephites? I mean, yeah, he just came home off his mission and hadn't had any success. But what else had happened among the Nephites that made him feel so bad? So to be so discouraged? Let me go back to chapter 6, where he talks about this. Why he was feeling so bad. Sounds like today. And it came to pass that on the other hand, that the Nephites did build them up and support them, beginning at the more wicked part of them, until they had overspread all the land of the Nephites, and had seduced the more part of the righteous. You hear that? Had seduced the more part of the righteous, until they had come down to believe in their works and partake of their spoils. Just like the wicked Gadiant and robber, partaking of the spoils, spreading the wealth around, and to join with them in their secret murders and combinations. And then he says, and thus they did obtain the sole management of the government. And so the very thing that this wicked Gadiant and robber chieftain was saying, we're going to redistribute the wealth. All we want is control of government so we can redistribute the wealth. Nephi is now saying, this is what's happened. It's what's happened. The Gadiant robbers are filling the judgment seats. The more part of the righteous have been seduced to believe in the works, partake of the spoils, and they had taken control of government. We can read about the Nephites and the Jaredites being corrupted with the spoils of government, but what about us? Are we there? Or how close to this fullness of iniquity that these prophets saw are we? When Nephi got up on the tower and he was preaching to these people, he got a bunch of them mad at him. And he goes on to record that a bunch of these Gadiant and robbers that were part of the government and part of the judges were out in the crowd listening to him. And they got mad as he got up and started preaching about their sins and talking about the government. And they started yelling at the crowd, Why seest thou this man, and hearest him revile against this people and against our law? For behold, Nephi had spoken unto them concerning the corruptness of their law. You see what happens when you go after the bad guys in government, when you talk about how they've corrupted the law? They get mad. They want to put you to death. And Nephi's been out on a mission. He's been out preaching the word. He comes home discouraged. He gets up on his tower, and these people want to destroy him. They want to destroy him because he talks about their law and how they've corrupted it. And as he said earlier, in the earlier chapter, they'd taken over the government, filling the judgment seats. One of the warnings about how these things hurt us is the warning of Harold B. Lee, and I'm going to give this one again. I gave this a few weeks ago in his teachings book. Let me read part of his warning that goes along with what we've been reading about here today about the Nephites. Now keep in mind, with all the crowding in of the socialistic reform programs that are threatening the very foundation of the church, if you want to see if I'm making this up, go to the Teachings of Harold B. Lee. This is pages 314, 315. Repeat that last part. The socialistic reform programs that are threatening the very foundation of the church. We must never forget what the Lord said, that the church may stand independent above all other creatures beneath the celestial world. Okay, what's the threat to this independence above all other creatures beneath the celestial world? Socialism. Socialistic reform programs. That's what he's warning us about. It's threatening the foundation of the church. Whenever we allow ourselves to become entangled and have to be subsidized, I'm quoting again, from government sources, and we think that it's the expedient way to do business in this day when we yield to such pressures, I warn you that government subsidies are not the Lord's way. And if we begin to accept, we are on our way to becoming subsidized politically as well as financially. Okay, is there something basically evil about socialism? Is it evil? Well, he seems to think it is. He says it's threatening the very foundation of the church. We finished President Lee. We've read President McKay. Here's another statement by President McKay. No wonder in trying to perpetuate that idea, they become Antichrist, because that doctrine strikes directly against the doctrine of the Savior. Now, that's the last sentence of a paragraph I want to read you now from President McKay. I wanted to read this last sentence. Let me give it to you again. No wonder in trying to perpetuate that idea, they become Antichrist, because that doctrine strikes directly against the doctrine of the Savior. Okay, he's talking about people promoting welfare state, promoting socialism, and how this leads them to becoming Antichrist. Let me read his words here, so it's not just me leading you on here. President McKay. This is on page 23 of David O. McKay's Statements on Communism and the Constitution of the United States. It's a little red and blue booklet. There's pink and black another time, they reprints. But anyway, let me quote him here. We are placed on this earth to work, to live, and the earth will give us a living. It is our duty to strive to make a success of what we possess, to till the earth, subdue the matter, conquer the glebe, take care of the cattle, the flocks, and the herds. It is the government's duty to see that you are protected in these efforts, and no other man has the right to deprive you of any of your privileges. But it is not the government's duty to support you. That is one reason why I shall raise my voice, as long as God gives me sounder ability, against this communistic idea that the government will take care of us all, and everything belongs to the government. It is wrong. And then giving you this quote that I read earlier, no wonder in trying to perpetuate that idea, they become Antichrist, because that doctrine strikes directly against the doctrine of the Savior. Socialism, okay, I'm going to stop quoting here now. He's talking about socialism, communism, redistribution of wealth, partners of all our substance, to quote the Gadianton robbers, filling the judgment seats, partaking of the spoils. He sees it. He's talking about it. Now, I wanted to go on and talk about a non-Mormon who became a Christian, who confirms what President McKay said, what President Hunter said, what President Lee said, what President Benson said, what President Joseph Smith. Well, in past shows I've given you quotes from all 16 prophets condemning socialism. I want to go down to a man named Whittaker Chambers. He wrote a book called Witness. I don't know if any of you ever have ever read this book. It was written back in 1952. It's over 800 pages. And my father had a long list of communist books he had written. He had a pile of communist books he read. I mean, Dad didn't write them. He read them. He was trying to find out what the communists believed. I've read many books dealing with socialism and communism. My father had this big library of them. One day I said to him, Dad, why do you have so many books written by communists? He had a bunch of books written by the communists here in the U.S., written by the communists in Russia. I've got some of his library now. Dad divided it up among the kids, but I said, why do you have all these books? He felt anyone who studied it, communism, saw the mass murders, the enforced atheism, the destruction of the family, and the continual oppression of the individual. Yet, as my father pointed out, it was still attractive to many people, to many rich, many poor people, intelligent, educated, uneducated people. And he said he had all these books because he was trying to figure out what was it about socialism and communism that had such an appeal, what pulled the people into it. And I don't know if you ever read C.S. Lewis's works. One of his books, he talked about the impossibility of a Christian trying to get inside the mind of an unrepentant sinner. So you can say, if I can just say this to him, he'll repent. if I can understand what wavelength he's on, I can step in there, run interference with that wavelength, and I can convert him back to Christ. I can bring him back to correct principles. C.S. Lewis, though, he discussed it and said a Christian can't mentally think like an unrepentant sinner. Because to the Christian, God is omnipresent. I've gone over this in past shows. Daddy, like any Christian, could not think outside the fact that God lives. Hence, he could not think like a communist. He could not put their shoes on and see why they became communists. Well, he kept gathering up these books, reading them, trying to say, what are they thinking? What is the appeal? Because anybody that studies their history, when they take over a country, they go from a little socialism to heavy communism, they murder hundreds of millions. Well, anyway, he came across this book called Witness by Whittaker Chambers. And Chambers was a very good writer. I read this book several times myself. My dad marked up this book more than any of the other books he had on communism. But Chambers, Whittaker Chambers, he goes in and explains in detail why he became a communist and why he worked as a spy for them. He was an American. And after leaving communism, he wrote his own history of his journey into and then out of communism. And he has a way of writing, a way of expressing himself that lets you walk right with him. You'll shed some tears with him if you ever read this book. You'll feel with him. You'll cry with him. And you'll endure with him, and then you'll turn to Christ with him as he talks about what he went through. Well, when my father read this book, he said this was, to him, his answer, the closest he could get to understanding why a person becomes a communist, what they think they're accomplishing. Whittaker Chambers gave my father this insight. Like I say, he had it marked up than any other book. The book was over 800 pages. Well, anyway, I hope this brief review will cause you to want to acquire and read this book and pass it on to others. If every American would read that book, we would not have the problems we have today with people turning towards socialism, being seduced to believe in the works. They'd turn away from it because they'd see where it leads. Let me go to page 8 of this book here. I've written down some quotes here. I see in communism the focus of the concentrated evil of our time. It is the great alternative faith of mankind. It is the vision of man's mind displacing God as the creative intelligence of the world. This man went in and out of communism, and to him this was a spiritual journey. Page 10, another quote here. Communism restores to man his sovereignty by the simple method of denying God. You think he didn't, but you think he would know something about President McKay or these other men, where they talked about it being soul-destroying, threatening the foundation of the church, the fullness of iniquity, our prophets. Denying God, that's his way of saying it. Okay, let me go to pages 16 and 17. This is touching. I date my break from a very casual happening. I was sitting, by break, he's talking about when he left the Communist Party. It didn't happen until years after this particular experience, but that's the word break he's talking about, leaving the Communists. I was sitting in our apartment on St. Paul Street in Baltimore. That was in Maryland, where he was running this communist cell that worked out of Washington, D.C. He lived in Baltimore. My daughter was in her high chair. I was watching her eat. She was the most miraculous thing that had ever happened in my life. My eye came to rest on the delicate convolutions of her ear, those intricate, perfect ears. The thought passed through my mind, no, those ears were not created by any chance coming together of atoms in nature, the communist view. They have been created only by immense design. I'm skipping through some of this, trying to give you the nuts here. I did not know that at that moment the finger of God was first laid upon my forehead. Hence, every sincere break with communism is a religious experience. A communist breaks because he must choose at last between irreconcilable opposites, God or man, soul or mind, freedom or communism. There has never been a society or a nation without God, but history is cluttered with the wreckage of nations that became indifferent to God and died. The crisis of communism exists to the degree in which it has failed to free the peoples that it rules from God. Repeat that last sentence. The crisis of communism exists to the degree which it has failed to free the people that it rules from God. The crisis of the Western world exists to the degree in which it is indifferent to God. Faith in God or faith in man is the challenge. Faith in God. Well, I hope you'd read this book. This is, it's touching. An atheist, he would be angry reading this, because this man talks about the socialist, the communist. When a man becomes brutal and wants the redistribution of wealth, that's when he loses his faith in God. That's when he walks away from God. That's part and parcel of it. Well, going on to page 82 here, out of this book, Witness, by Whittaker Chambers. At some point, I sought relief from my distress by trying to pray. I had tried to pray a few times before in my boyhood and my youth. Let me digress here. He came from a home where there was a little bit of religion talked about occasionally, but they were basically agnostics. His father was an adulterer, didn't support them worth a darn. You read his history, it's sad. He had a brother who committed suicide, and he wept and wept about that. Oh, you got to read that book. I mean, it's good. At some point, I sought relief from my distress by trying to pray. I had tried to pray a few times before in my boyhood and my youth. I had not been successful. You ever heard people say that I prayed, didn't make any difference, so I quit, I gave it up? My whole life as a man lay between those failures and my present need. As I continued to pray raggedly, prayer ceased to be an awkward and self-conscious act. It became a daily need to which I looked forward. So here's a man who didn't just pray and say, oh, that's too bad, nobody cares. He turned back to God, and he said, I failed, but I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed raggedly. And prayer pretty soon ceased to be an awkward and self-conscious act. It became a daily need to which you look forward to. Any Christian who's a Christian can identify with what Whittaker Chambers says there. Okay, I'll keep going here. This man got real discouraged at time. As I stepped down into the dark hall, this is pages 84, 85, I found myself stopped, not by a constraint, but by a hush of my whole being. Now he's trying to describe a spiritual experience here. He was considering suicide, and he was praying. You got to read this book. It is good. In this organic hush, a voice said with perfect distinctness, if you will fight for freedom, all will be well with you. On one side of that moment were nearly 40 years of human waste on all the paths and goat paths of 20th century air and action. He's talking about himself here. On the other side was humility and liberation. Henceforth in the depth of my being there was peace and a strength that nothing could shake. It never left me, because I no longer groped for God. I felt God. The experience was absolute. I only knew that I had promised God my life, even if it were His will to death. This is my ultimate witness. And he names the book Witness. Well, I wanted to go over these quotes to point out that this man felt communism and socialism was a spiritual battle between God and the devil. It is a spiritual battle. You or I are also a part of it. The two sides are headed by the same people, pleading for us to follow them, that pleaded with us in the pre-existence. This man had followed Satan, and now he turned back to God. And once again, here on this earth. You and I have the opportunity to choose to follow Christ or to follow Satan. I mean, you and I might say, why couldn't that first round have been enough? Well, God rules in the heavens, and once again we get the chance to be deceived. Once again we get the chance to choose. Whittaker Chambers is explaining the situation he went through. He also goes on to talk about socialism, or as we call it today, or we call it today socialism. In his day it was called the New Deal. And a few shows back I talked about the fact that in 1932, 60% of the Utahns voted for him, or 62%. In 36, after everybody knew that the New Deal meant socialism, the redistribution of wealth, Utah voted 69% for him. So we can hardly shout that we did not do what the Nephites and the Jaredites did. We joined the Gadianton robbers. We like this redistribution of wealth too. We too gave up on God. We too turned to government to redistribute wealth. I wanted to go in and read here out of his book again what he said about the New Deal when he's trying to talk about we Americans, talking about our president that we had elected, how he saw it when he was still a communist running a communist espionage cell in Washington, D.C. This is on pages 471. I've got some breaks as I went through trying to cut down on how long this would be to try to read it to you. Try to again give you the nuts and leave some of the shaft and periphery. But, well, it's all good stuff, but I mean I'm trying to get to the kernels here. Page 471. I took my first hard look at the New Deal. All the New Dealers I had known were communists or near communists. They regarded it as an instrument for gaining their own revolutionary ends. So he's talking about the people he ran around with, which happened to be fellow spies working in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. government. Then he goes on here. I saw how misleading those surface manifestations were, and tactically how advantageous, for they concealed the inner drift of this great government. That drift was prevailingly towards socialism, though the mass of those who, in part directed, in part were carried along by it, sincerely supposed that they were liberals. The New Deal was a genuine revolution whose deepest purpose was not simply reform within existing traditions, but a basic change in the social and above all the power relationships within the nation. It was not a revolution by violence. It was a revolution by bookkeeping. Doggone, I'm an accountant. I'm a bookkeeper. But I wasn't part of that. Still am not. It was a revolution by bookkeeping and lawmaking. Insofar as it was successful, the power of politics had replaced the power of business. This is the basic power shift of all revolutions of our time. See, he's talking about the New Deal. A revolution took place. Socialism, that's what he calls it, socialism, our great government, this inner drift. And he says it's a revolution. Well, that's his next sentence here. This shift was the revolution. It was only of incidental interest that the revolution was not complete, that it was made not by tanks and machine guns, but by acts of Congress and decisions of the Supreme Court. Whether the revolutionists prefer to call themselves Fabians, who seek power by the inevitability of gradualism, or Bolsheviks, who seek power by the dictatorship of the proletariat, the struggle is for power. Again, he hadn't read about the Gadianton robbers. He hadn't read J. Reuben Clark or David O. McKay or Harold B. Lee. He hadn't read any of these men. But he sees communism, socialism. The struggle is for power. Continuing quoting him now. Men who sincerely abhorred the word communism in the pursuit of common ends found that they were unable to distinguish communists from themselves. Now, this man's sitting back looking at Americans. And this is true. I mean, it's amazing. I have liberal friends today. They can't see it. They're right there, what he said in 1952. Men who sincerely abhorred the word communism in the pursuit of common ends, he's talking about the common ends of the socialist, the New Dealer, the liberal, they have common ends, Hence they found they were unable to distinguish communists from themselves, except that it was just the communists who were likely to be most forthright and most dedicated to the common cause. Continuing the quote here, this is, I think, another reason my dad saw this too, but I think that's another reason he felt this man really hit the nail on the head. This color blindness was all the more dogged because it was completely honest. In other words, these people are honest. They're socialists, they're liberals, they're honest. He goes on here, for men who could not see that what they firmly believed was liberalism, added up to socialism, could scarcely be expected to see what added up to communism. So going back up above here, he talks about the revolution, not a revolution of violence, but a revolution of bookkeeping and lawmaking, a revolution by the Supreme Court. It was not by tanks, machine guns, it was by acts of Congress. And then he goes on, these people that were a part of this revolution of changing the power struggle. Read that again. This is so unbelievably true today that everybody ought to hear this. This political colorblindness was all the more dogged because it was completely honest. For men who could not see that what they firmly believed was liberalism added up to socialism could scarcely be expected to see what added up to communism. Again, the prophets. You read these men, they did not stay up nights trying to distinguish between a socialist and a communist. They use these words interchangeably. Just like Whittaker Chambers does here. They're the same thing. Okay, keep quoting Whittaker Chambers here. Every move against the communists was felt by the liberals as a move against themselves. Continue to quote him. One of my close friends, himself an ardent New Dealer, who knew my story in full detail, summed up the situation tersely. I see, he said one day, why it might not pay the communists to kill you at this point, but I don't see how the administration dares to leave you alive. I hope you watch Glenn Beck. He points out a lot of these parallels. He has a lot of good stuff. And he's trying to warn us also. The parallels, where these people are going. Where is the liberal going? Where is the socialist going? What are they trying to do? It's a revolution. It's a real revolution. Here's another quote. When he was, this goes back to page 21, when he was in the darkness. This is his son calling for him. He stepped outside in the dark, calling, Papa, Papa. Then frantically on the verge of tears, Papa, I walked over to him. I felt that I was making the most terrible surrender I should have to make on earth. Papa. He cried and threw his arms around me. Don't ever go away. Both of us knew the words go away stood for something else, and that I'd given him my promise not to kill myself. This man suffered a lot. He suffered a lot at the hands of our government. He tried to reveal what had happened, and he was stopped. Remember, he was trying to expose what was going on when our president, FDR, was trying to stop him. Supreme Court justices were trying to stop him. Senators, congressmen were trying to stop him. The press was trying to stop him because he was exposing socialism, communism, the New Deal as all being part and parcel of what the communists were trying to bring to this nation, and they all united to persecute him, to quote someone else. They wanted to ruin him, and he got discouraged. 2 or 3 times he got discouraged enough to seriously consider suicide. Let me go through some more of his quotes here. We've got a little more time here. If you want to call in here again, 801-224-1414. Here's another reference to the communists. The important point about the Washington apparatus, and by the way, he was the head of it, is that in the 1930s the revolutionary mood had become so acute throughout the whole world that the Communist Party could recruit its agents, not here and there but by scores, but within the government of the United States. They were a true fifth column. He worked right there. He worked with them. He was gathering up spies. He says they could gather them by the scores. I had prepared my break from the Communist Party with careful guile. But through Noel, that was a communist that he had gone to that he thought he could trust when he was leaving, the shadow of the party and its secret apparatuses had fallen on me. How silly to suppose that any man by his own efforts can ever save himself, which of course is a reference to his conversion to Christianity. Well, if you get this book, the first part of the book, Chambers, the first 100 pages, he summarizes his life briefly. Then the next 700 pages, he carefully covers in detail the history of his childhood, his youth, his college experiences, which helped make him a communist, his work for them. Then he details his break, his hiding from them, his getting a gun, his financial success at Time magazine, and the trial that he went through. These are all covered. He makes the point over and over and over that only moral, religious people who choose Christ can resist the secularism, the seduction of liberalism or socialism. That's one of the reasons I think my dad liked this book, because he saw this man that went in and then came back out. Here's another one of his observations. I have met, this Whittaker Chambers, I should say, not my father. I have met few communists whom I thought knew more than the bare rudiments of Marxian economics, or cared to. But I have never known a communist who was not acutely aware of the crisis of history, whose solution he found in communism's practical program, its vision and its faith. Communism is never stronger than the failure of other faiths. Again, he's making the observation that the strong Christian is not going to be susceptible to this. He might be tricked, but you're susceptible to the belief of liberalism, socialism, communism, only to the degree that your faith in God has waned. Here's a story about, I'm just going to give a couple of parts out of this one. He was out walking around one night with his boss. Giving a quote here. A shivering derelict came up to us and asked for a handout. This was in the dead of winter. Harry, this was his boss, glanced past him, which was the proper communist attitude. Communists hold that to give alms is to dull the revolutionary spirit of the masses. Is a communist charitable? No. He's not. That dulls the revolutionary spirit. That's one of the reasons I would say, one of the reasons our prophets say, one of the reasons President Monson has added a fourth part to our mission of the church is to help other people, to help them, be good to them. This dulls the revolutionary spirit. If you're a charitable person and you find someone in need, he's not going to lose everything. He's not going to become despairing and discouraged. He sees the goodness of mankind, and if it's a Christian who helps him, he may say, I want to be a Christian. I want to be among those people. Whittaker Chambers, another one of his quotes. In the end, the only memorable experiences, like the only memorable experiences, are religious and moral. Religious and moral. That's what it comes down to. And to him, communism and socialism, this was a religion. This was the fight, to fight against their religion. Let me give some more quotes on him. Like the governments, the great majority of Time's personnel was always overwhelmingly non-communist. In fact, half the difficulty was that communism was so remote from the experience of most Time people that they could not identify a communist even when he was quoting Lenin. Their innocence sometimes made them almost perfect dupes. Can you think of anything relating to us today? Reminds me of my father's test that he gave the students at BYU for several years, several hundred students. in which they were answering 35 questions, and included in that was whether or not they believed in this political philosophy or this political philosophy. What Dad did not tell them was included in that was the 10 points of the Communist Manifesto. 2/3 of them believed in the socialist plan for overtaking our country and destroying it. Well, this has been a sober show. I've been going back reading this book, Whittaker Chambers' Witness book again, and seeing his despair, his discouragement. I wish he had known the prophets. I wish he had known my father. I wish he had known the Book of Mormon to see, hey, we're going to win this. But so many of us are duped. So many of us have been suckered in to believing what he fought. Socialism, communism. We've been tricked. We've been duped. And it's personal righteousness and our own charity that's going to save us from being seduced and fall. The great thing that we have going for us is we have prophets. And if we'll follow them, we'll be spared. We'll be spared. Well, it's been a good morning. I hope you get this book, Witness, by Whittaker Chambers. You can walk with him, talk with him, and cry with him. And he ends up on God's side. He ends up with us as one of the Christians. Have a good day. And I'll look forward to seeing you again next week. I hope you enjoy conference this weekend, and have a good day.
If tomorrow all the things were gone I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. Thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. To be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
The preceding was a paid commercial program. Opinions expressed are the sole responsibility of the party expressing them.
1400 K-Star.